Okay, in this video we're going to be looking further into when a budgetary policy stance is either contractionary or expansionary. So in the last video we discussed that the higher the deficit, the more expansionary the budget, or the lower the surplus, the more expansionary the budget, and the deficits are generally considered expansionary and surpluses generally considered contractionary. That's true. However, when we're looking at whether a budget is contractionary or expansionary, we're generally honing in or focusing on the deliberate or discretionary measures. So what I mean by that is, if a budget deficit is in deficit purely because of automatic reasons, or purely because the economy is growing quite slowly, the budget can still be quite contractionary and we still have a deficit, because regardless of how contractionary our budget is, we still can't get it back to surplus because we're purely just not collecting enough revenue from our economic growth, from our level of employment. So a budget surplus can in fact be quite expansionary if the economy is booming so much, if the government's collecting so much tax and so much income tax, so much company tax, and paying barely any welfare, but they're still employing expansionary policies. So if our economy was in the midst of a peak, let's say we were growing at 10%, even if the government was employing expansionary discretionary policy after expansionary policy, spending money on infrastructure, cutting taxes, we're still likely to have a surplus because we're collecting so much money in income and company tax and paying so little welfare. So budgets are often referred to as relatively expansionary, contractionary, or neutral in terms of the impact they have on the economy, and we generally look at the discretionary measures within the budget. So for example, in 2007 we had a surplus of 10 billion. Then in 2008 we had a surplus of 15 billion. Now on the face of it, that looks contractionary. And if that's the only information you get, that's what you say. The budget has been contractionary, there's been more money leaked from the economy relative to injections, this will have a slow down the level of aggregate demand. But in actual fact, during that period of time, the government was actually acting in quite an expansionary fashion. You see, in 2008 the economy was absolutely booming. We were in the midst of the mining boom, we automatically collected over $20 billion more revenue from 2007 to 2008. The automatic stabilisers were pushing the budget potentially to, say, a $30, $40 billion surplus. And that was all from extra income tax, extra company tax, lower welfare. But the government actually decided to be really expansionary and employed $15 billion worth of tax cuts, which took the surplus from $30 billion down to $15 billion. So despite the fact that the surplus increased from this year to this year, the actual discretionary measures within the budget were quite expansionary. So a bigger surplus can still be considered expansionary if it's only a bigger surplus because of automatic stabilisers. If the discretionary policies are still implemented to try and boost growth, then we would still refer to it as an expansionary budget. Here's another example. Okay, this is now our economy is going poorly in 2014-2015. A $29 billion deficit implies that it was an expansionary budget. Okay, the government is collecting $29 billion less than they're giving out. However, in actual fact, the budget was only in such a big deficit because of automatic stabilisers. We had unemployment of over 6%, growth was really slow, and the lower terms of trade was causing considerably less company tax. The actual discretionary measures within the budget were quite contractionary. This is the budget where they implemented the 2% levy on high income earners. They wanted to increase the GP co-payment. This was the really unpopular budget that was Joe Hockey's first budget and with Malcolm Turnbull. And basically, the discretionary policies were quite contractionary despite the fact we had a big deficit. So back in 2007, we were being expansionary but still had a surplus. Back in 2015, we have a deficit but we're trying to be quite contractionary. So we focus mainly on the discretionary measures in the budget. A couple of things to also note. You've got to look at the type of government spending that's occurring as well. For example, infrastructure spending is going to boost our economy and aggregate demand more than spending on foreign aid, which isn't really going to help the Australian economy at all, perhaps except for maybe giving us improved trade relationships. So you've also got to look at what the actual policies are to determine how expansionary the budget is. A budget deficit can still be relatively contractionary if A, it's a smaller deficit than last year, or B, the discretionary measures within the budget are actually quite contractionary and we're only in a deficit because of weak economic growth and the automatic reasons. So they're the two main reasons. A deficit can be contractionary if one, it's smaller than last year, or two, if it's only due to automatic reasons. With the same logic, a budget surplus can be quite expansionary if A, it's a smaller surplus than last year, Or B, the discretionary policies are quite expansionary, but we're still in a surplus because we're just thriving. We're collecting so much income tax and so much company tax and paying very little in welfare. So to summarise, the budget and actual budget outcome are often very different due to the presence of both automatic and discretionary stabilisers. Deficits are generally considered expansionary and surplus contractionary. However, a surplus can sometimes be expansionary if it's smaller than last year, or if it's only caused by automatic stabilisers and the discretionary policies are quite expansionary. A deficit is smaller than last year's, or is due to automatic stabilisers, can be considered contractionary. Explain how a budget deficit is likely to affect economic activity in the short term. Budget deficit is intended to expand the economy. Don't always remember that. A budget deficit is generally considered to expand the economy because it's increasing injections relative to leakages. The government is putting more back into the economy than it is taking out, and it's aiming to boost aggregate demand, boost spending, and reduce unemployment. Budget surpluses, on the other hand, are considered to contract the level of economic activity because leakages are higher than injections, and the government is taking out more out of the economy than it is putting back in, which is slowing aggregate demand. Explain why a focus on the discretionary component of the budget provides information about the stance of budgetary policy. Very tough question, but the discretionary measures is telling us more about what the government's intention is, or what their deliberate measures are doing as part of this budget. It is the deliberate or discretionary policies that give us the best indication of what the government's stance is and what their aim is for the budget, not the automatic impacts on the budget. And finally, explain how a budget surplus might be considered consistent with an expansionary budgetary policy stance. So think about those words. Surplus, expansionary. You should be going straight to, well, it might be smaller than last year, or it might be due to automatic factors and the discretionary policies are still quite expansionary. So if the surplus is due to high levels of economic growth and employment and less expenses from automatic stabilisers, it will still be expansionary if the discretionary policies are expansionary. Or if the surplus is smaller than last year. And perhaps provide an example. Okay, so if the government's implementing tax cuts or spending or infrastructure, but they're still collecting so much tax that they're in a surplus, that would still be an expansionary budget. Thanks for listening.